Hey, everybody. Thanks for being with us as we close out the week. On this Thursday, we are working our way through the 4th chapter of John, a pretty weighty chapter, and we catch Jesus in a pretty weighty discussion with an unlikely partner, a woman from Samaria who has come out to get water, and Jesus has kind of broken with custom by engaging her in conversation, both because she's a woman and because she's a Samaritan. And we left off yesterday at verse 15. The woman has a misunderstanding, which we've told you that John, the author, loves to use as a teaching tool. And she said, I'd love to have this water that I could not have to come here. I'd love to have this water that Jesus referenced as welling up inside of her to bring eternal life. And so with that, Jesus uses a springboard. He uses that comment as a springboard, and the conversation takes a pretty interesting turn. So we'll jump in here in 16, and then we'll talk it through. Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You're right in saying you have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you've said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on the mountain, but you say the place where people must worship is Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on the mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." So as we get into this part of the text, probably something that needs to be noted on the front end, a lot of details have been written. A lot of stuff has been conjectured about this particular woman's situation and what Jesus means by bringing it up. And I think we should exercise caution there. The text does not dwell on it. For John, it seems to be an example of the way in which Jesus knows people's backstory. We've said that the portrayal in John of Jesus is kind of the all-knowing one. And so it's very interesting that after this moment where the woman says, "I would love to have living water and not be thirsty again," Jesus then says, "Go call your husband and come back." Now, it is likely, given the information we get next, that she's had 5 husbands and is with somebody else currently, that this is to be seen as a sense of her brokenness and maybe one of the wounded places of her life. It could also be that Jesus is simply letting her know that he knows, not only does he know what he's saying, which seems odd to her, but he knows her. He knows her life as well. And so I think sometimes the church has been over-interested in these kind of details of this woman's story, which we don't really know other than to say, clearly, there's something here that is telling and is compelling for the woman as she hears Jesus give it voice.
This moment in this story is a transitional moment, and I think that you're wise to encourage us, Clint, to not do a lot of speculation as to the particular details of husbands. Scholars talk about how though there is not Old Testament law, there's not requirements about the maximum number of divorces available. Apparently, scribes tended to limit that by their interpretation to 2 or 3. So there's some questions that scholars might work through there. But I think that that's a little bit of a red herring. I think instead we should really be fixated on this transition happening in the story, because here in verse 15, the woman continues to be fixated on the mundane. She continues to make the water and specifically the getting physical water out of the physical well, which was physically built by Jacob. That you're right. It's this long, very practical, surface level conversation for her. What John is doing in this moment is showing us how Jesus is now interrupting that pattern. So it's been Jesus talking at this level and the woman just maybe even talking in an entirely different sort of sphere, even not even different level. And now here, Jesus is going to bring this into stark and very concrete details when he asks her about her personal life. This is no longer about an ancient thing and separation between Jews and Samaritans, sorry. Like this idea that there's some kind of cultural conversation happening ceases, and we now enter into what is far more of a prophetic kind of discourse. And here we have good reason to believe that this is becoming effective. So when she responds in verse 19, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet," it has a way of beginning to change the tone of the text. A woman who's been very skeptical, a woman who's been missing the point on each one of these interchanges, now is suddenly a woman who you can almost imagine, Clint, is leaning in and is starting to get a sense for the kind of power that Jesus has. If you get fixated on the details of the story, you might miss the fundamental point of the story, that this woman is beginning to see some of the light. She's met Jesus at noon, but she's now beginning to see some of the divine revelation that Jesus is offering. And the tool he's using at this point to sort of wedge into that is to make it clear that he has understanding, very personal understanding of what's happening in her life. And we're beginning to see that to make an impact.
Yeah, and so example here, I've heard this passage taught or preached, and this detail is thought to give explanation as to why it is that she's getting water at noon and why she's doing that out of town. And the conjecture is that, she's an outcast and that she is a loose woman and people in town don't accept her. None of that's in the text. And there's no judgment from Jesus. There's no conviction here. This is Jesus giving a woman a deep insight about her own life, which corroborates what he has been saying and what he's going to say. Now, having said that, right, 5 husbands and a current living situation, clearly there's something pastoral, something psychological. There is a sense in which Jesus is engaging her at the rough or at the messy levels of her life. Let's say she's been widowed a bunch of times. That's still pain. I mean, there certainly is a reason that Jesus gives these particular details. And then notice what Jesus says. What you have said is true. Because what is Jesus in the book of John? He is the arbiter of truth. He knows what is true. And then she says, I see that you are a prophet. Now, notice the subtle movement we're getting in the text. She encounters a man who confuses her because he's a Jew who speaks to her. Then he confuses her by saying odd things. Now she sees a man in front of her who is a prophet, who knows things, spiritual things. And that leads instantly to a new question. Now, maybe some people are right and she's trying to change the subject as fast as she can, but that's not what John says to us. She simply then says, okay, I see that you're a prophet. You know these things. So tell me this, where should we worship? And that allows Jesus this springboard to have a conversation about real worship, which isn't about the place where it happens, but the heart of the one doing it. And again, this is vintage, wonderful example of John. Worshipers worship the Father in spirit and truth. It doesn't matter if they're in Samaria, doesn't matter if they're in Jerusalem. What matters is what they bring to that task. God is spirit, and those who worship must worship in spirit and in truth. So what Jesus doesn't do is give this woman a lecture about lifestyle. He gives her a lesson about what it means to be a believer, a follower of God. And he says here, salvation belongs to the Jews, which is going to be, I think, at least I would argue, a reference to himself in this coming reveal that's about to happen. But I think there's a danger here, Michael, in that we get caught up in one detail and maybe we miss the forest for the trees a little bit when we do that. And there is more at play here than the specific details of some of this woman's, perhaps her personal struggles.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think that we might rush past the fact that John is casting a Samaritan woman in this unbelievably important role. But that would be a mistake, because John has a whole cast of characters that Jesus has met through his lifetime. I mean, the other Gospels detail very prominent Jews, even very prominent Gentiles, even Roman centurions. So Jesus in his life encounters people who would be witnesses par excellence, people who you would want to testify for you in the court of public opinion. But when John's going to give us an account, Clint, of people who Jesus speaks to, of people that Jesus reveals to, he's not going to pass by the woman at the well. He's not going to pass by a woman who has had some struggles. I mean, real difficult moments in her life. And that's a really amazing reorientation to what the gospel is about. And by that, I mean who Jesus is about, right? Because Jesus on this day has interrupted a woman's normal. She has to go get water. That's a part of what she needs to do. She's doing that at this point of day because she's got other stuff that needs done as well. And here, in this moment, she has an unexpected encounter with God in flesh. And in this moment, Jesus is entering deeper into her life. And then this amazing turn to worship, the idea of, you know, what could be read as her sort of challenging Jesus on a decades-old, a generations-old debate about the place of worship. Jesus turns it into a moment of unbelievable revelation. God is spirit. Those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. That's a kind of invitation that Jesus offers to this woman. And ultimately, it's the kind of invitation that has the power to change a life, to turn someone from a person going through the drudgery of another day into the kind of person who goes out and proclaims and testifies and becomes a witness to the revelation that they have seen. I'm getting a little ahead of where we are, Clint. I understand that. I'm foreshadowing what we're going to see happening here. But I think it's just really important that we pause here for a second and realize that of the cast of characters that John's going to portray in only the 4th chapter of the book, this woman, I think, stands for us to be an excellent reminder of the kind of character that Jesus wants to testify to him. And that's a person who's lived real life, had real struggles. And this woman is included in that revelation. And I think that the text invites us, by her inclusion, to recognize that we are included as well.
Well, I think revelation is the right word, Michael, because in the Gospel of John, certainly people don't reason their way to Jesus. They don't holy their way or righteous their way to Jesus. That is always a revealed truth. And so as we continue the last part of this part of the story, we see the revelation here. The woman said to him, I know the Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us. Jesus said to her, I am he, the one who is speaking to you. And so here we have this moment where, having been engaged in this deeply spiritual conversation, worship, spirit, truth, this woman is moved to say, either feeling out who Jesus might be or simply as a statement of her own faith, well, we know the Messiah is coming, the one who called Christ. Messiah and Christ are the same word, just one is Messiah is Hebrew, Christ is Greek. When he comes, he will proclaim. In other words, well, I know that one day the Messiah will come and make all this clear. And there are a couple ways, I think, to read this. You could read this as incredibly ironic that she would say this to Jesus, or you could say that she is beginning to suspect there's more to this man than she's seen, that it's possible she is asking the soft question here, could you be the one? Could this be the one? Which is not an unfamiliar question in the Gospel of John. And however it is she gets there, Jesus, in a moment that's uncharacteristic in some of the Gospels, but pretty typical in John, says, I am he. And we'll need to unpack the specific words, I am. That's important in the Gospel of John. Jesus is going to say some things about himself, and he's going to always preface those by saying, I am. This is not one of those statements, but he introduces the language here, or we are introduced to the language. But here, Jesus now says to this woman, not only are you right about the coming of the Christ, he's standing right in front of you. And this is a profound and powerful moment in the gospel.
So we're going to unpack this more as the book goes on. Definitely subscribe to stick with us and to go along the study with us. But I just want to point out in verse 26 here, when Jesus says, I am, my translation says, I am he, that with the idea of emphasizing with the he. But this is about as close as you get without crossing the line towards referencing what would have been a very well-known statement that God makes to Moses from the book of Exodus, when God reveals himself in the burning bush. I am that I am is what we have translated in our Bibles. Jesus isn't saying exactly that, but this is the kind of statement that gives that kind of resonance and reverberation, and it would not have been lost on the people who heard it because of how impactful, powerful, oft repeated those words to Moses were in, first century Judaism. So it's just worth noting here, Clint, that Jesus is saying things that are pushing the limits of what could have even been understood. And I think if we're reading the book wholeheartedly, he's also pushing the limits of what we can understand. When he says, I'm the person, it's one thing to think about that detached with 1,000 years of gap. But if Jesus is the one asking you for water maybe 5 minutes ago and now is saying, I am, that's an unbelievable turn of circumstance. And it's an unbelievable way to consider that Jesus is willing to reveal himself. It's not on horseback. It's not with an army. It's not with loud trumpet and proclamation. It is in the most mundane and common of life circumstances where here this woman is hearing the Son of God, the Word enfleshed, reveal himself to be that I am. I am the one who's coming to proclaim these things to you, the Messiah, the Christ. This is a powerful moment of revelation, and you really need to join us when we continue the study next week, because what it does to this woman and the story that is still to come, John's not done yet, this is going to have an impact, and it is incredible to see it in her life and then to imagine for ourselves what it might also do for us.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to read this text, I am he. Jesus is claiming the Messiah. She says, I know the Christ will come and he'll explain everything. And Jesus says, I am. I'm he, the one speaking to you. And we can read that as the case that the gospel is making for Jesus. And so the part that may be surprising to us is the I am he. But don't miss the reverse, the one speaking to you. Don't miss the amazing irony that the Christ is speaking to the wounded and woman with a messy life who's going about her normal day. That he, the I am he, is engaging her. And that is no less shocking, I think, than the claim itself, that one would be speaking to this one, this woman. And so a really beautiful scene that John paints here. And rightly so, we've we've tended to focus on the Jesus side of the equation, as we should, but don't miss the obvious surprise in not only am I the Messiah, I'm talking to you. That's a surprising turn.
Well, I think this is full of surprises, and use the phrase, John's painting. I think that's exactly right. There's a sense in which this is masterfully told. There's more story to come, so do join us next week as we continue. Like this video, helps others find it in the midst of their study of John, whenever that might be, years to come. Subscribe yourself so that you can go along in the study, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.